A new world. The bright morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Okono family's modest apartment, casting long streaks of light across the dining table. Malik adjusted his tie nervously in the mirror, his heart thudding in his chest. Today was the day. His first day at Washington Middle School in suburban Ohio, a world apart from the bustling streets of Lagos, Nigeria, where the air was thick with the aroma of roadside suya, and the symphony of car horns played like an endless background score. "Malik, are you ready?" His mother's voice called from the kitchen. He nodded, more to himself than anyone else. His mother, Dr. Amina Okono, appeared in the doorway, her ever-present poise offering him a measure of comfort. "You look very handsome," she said with a warm smile. She was a linguistics professor, and the reason they had moved to America. Her new position at the university came with promises of growth and opportunities, not just for her but for Malik as well. Malik smiled back, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was excited but terrified. He had spent months preparing for this moment, watching American TV shows to practice his English and listening to his mother's reassurances about how he'd make friends and thrive in his new school. "Remember," his mother said, straightening his tie, "your accent is part of who you are. It tells a story about where you come from and the strength you carry with you. Don't ever be ashamed of it." Her words resonated, but Malik couldn't shake the apprehension that gnawed at his confidence. He wasn't just starting school. He was stepping into a world where everything, people, culture, even the air, was different. With a quick hug and a whispered prayer, he headed out the door. The school building loomed large and unfamiliar, its brick facade and neatly trimmed lawns starkly different from the chaotic vibrancy of his former school in Lagos. As Malik walked through the main entrance, he noticed the buzz of students filling the hallways. Their laughter and chatter echoed off the polished floors, creating a cacophony of sound that was both energizing and intimidating. Clutching his schedule, he navigated the corridors, his eyes darting to the signs above the doors. His first class was English with Mrs. Thompson. He took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door, stepping inside. The chatter in the room came to an abrupt halt as heads turned toward him. Malik froze, his heart pounding. Every pair of eyes seemed to bore into him, sizing him up, dissecting him. His hands clenched the straps of his backpack as he mustered a tentative smile. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 50s with a stern face and sharp eyes, looked up from her desk. "Ah, you must be our new student," she said, her tone brisk. "Class, we have a new addition. Why don't you introduce yourself?" Malik swallowed hard. The words he had rehearsed countless times felt suddenly foreign on his tongue. Stepping forward, he cleared his throat. "Hello, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves that gripped him. "My name is Malik Okono. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria, and I'm very happy to be here." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Some students exchanged curious glances. Others whispered behind their hands. A girl in the front row offered him an encouraging smile, but a boy in the back let out a stifled laugh. Malik tried to ignore it, continuing, "I like mathematics and football. Soccer. I hope we can all be friends." Mrs. Thompson's lips pursed slightly, and she nodded curtly. "Thank you, Malik. Please take a seat. We'll do our best to understand you as you get accustomed to clear English. It's very important in this class." The words, though spoken calmly, struck Malik like a slap. He hadn't expected his accent, something he had always taken pride in, to be a problem. He moved to an empty desk, the weight of Mrs. Thompson's comments settling heavily on his shoulders. His mother's advice about embracing his heritage echoed faintly in his mind, but in that moment, it felt distant and idealistic. As the lesson began, Malik tried to focus on the material, but his mind raced. He caught snippets of whispers from his classmates. "Did you hear how he talks?" one voice said. "Yeah, it's so weird," another replied. His face burned, but he kept his eyes on his notebook, determined not to let their words break him. He scribbled notes furiously, trying to drown out the sound of their giggles. Yet each laugh felt like a dagger, chipping away at his resolve. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Malik exhaled deeply, realizing he had been holding his breath. He quickly packed his things and left the room, avoiding eye contact with anyone. In the hallway, the noise of students rushing to their next class enveloped him. But Malik felt like he was moving in slow motion, a shadow among the crowd. That evening, Malik sat at the dining table, his dinner untouched. His mother noticed his uncharacteristic silence. "Malik," she said gently, "how was your first day?" "It was fine," he replied, forcing a smile. But his voice lacked conviction, and his mother's sharp eyes caught it. "Fine doesn't sound very convincing," she said. "Did something happen?" Malik hesitated, the weight of his experience pressing down on him. He didn't want to burden his mother, especially knowing how hard she worked to give him this opportunity. "No, Mama. Everything's okay," he said finally. Dr. Okono studied her son, her heart aching. She knew there was more to his words than he was letting on, but she also understood the need to give him space. "All right," she said softly. "But remember, you can always talk to me." Malik nodded, grateful for her understanding, but the knot in his chest remained. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he replayed the day in his mind. The whispers, the laughter, Mrs. Thompson's subtle dismissal, all of it swirled together in a storm of self-doubt. He had come to America with dreams of belonging, but now he wasn't so sure. Yet, beneath the uncertainty, a small ember of determination flickered. He had faced challenges before, and though this was unlike anything he had ever experienced, Malik resolved to find a way to rise above it. Little did he know, the journey ahead would not only test his resilience, but also ignite a movement that would transform his school and his life forever. The quiet storm. The days that followed Malik's first day at Washington Middle School were a blur of quiet humiliation and stifled hope. He quickly learned that the whispers weren't confined to just his classroom. The hallways, lunchroom, and even the library seemed to hum with the faint echoes of students discussing the new kid with the funny accent. Though he tried to focus on his studies, the weight of being different in an environment where uniformity seemed prized left him feeling like an outsider. At first, Malik tried to fit in. He softened his words, consciously flattening the lilts and cadences of his Nigerian accent. He listened intently to how his classmates spoke, practicing their pronunciation in front of the mirror each night. But no matter how hard he tried, the accent remained, an inextricable part of him that refused to be subdued. One morning in English class, Mrs. Thompson posed a question about the difference between literal and figurative language. Malik knew the answer immediately. His hand shot up, his heart racing as he waited for her to call on him. "Yes, Malik." Mrs. Thompson's tone was clipped, and her expression already seemed to anticipate a mistake. The phrase, "it's raining cats and dogs," is an example of figurative language. Malik began, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "It means it's raining heavily." Mrs. Thompson nodded but then frowned. "Yes, but can you say that again, this time more clearly?" The room grew still. Malik hesitated, unsure of what she meant. "Your pronunciation, Malik. You said raining instead of raining," she clarified, her lips curling into a condescending smile. "It's important to enunciate properly." Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Malik's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as he tried to repeat the sentence. This time, his voice quivered, and his words felt foreign in his mouth. The once proud boy who had loved the rhythm of his own speech now stumbled over syllables, his confidence eroded by the weight of Mrs. Thompson's critique. At lunch, Malik found an empty corner of the cafeteria where he could sit alone. His tray remained untouched as he stared out the window, longing for the sights and sounds of Lagos. He thought of the bustling streets, where vendors shouted over one another in a symphony of languages, and everyone's accent was celebrated as part of the city's rich tapestry. "Mind if I sit here?" A voice broke through his thoughts. Malik looked up to see a girl with curly hair and freckles. It was the same girl who had smiled at him during his first class. She held a lunch tray and was waiting patiently for his response. Sure, Malik said, surprised. I'm Clara, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. I like your answer in English today. Mrs. Thompson can be, well, a little intense. Malik gave a weak smile, unsure of how to respond. Clara continued, don't let her get to you. She's done that to a lot of students, especially anyone who doesn't speak like her. What do you mean? Malik asked, his curiosity piqued. Clara leaned in, lowering her voice. She's obsessed with proper English. A few years ago, she embarrassed a girl in front of the whole class for mispronouncing library. She said it like library, and Mrs. Thompson made her repeat it until she cried. Malik's heart sank. He wasn't alone in his struggle, but the thought offered little comfort. If anything, it made him feel worse, knowing that the teacher's behavior was a pattern rather than an isolated incident. That evening, Malik's mother noticed his subdued demeanor. As they sat down for dinner, she decided to probe gently. How was school today, Malik? She asked, setting a steaming plate of jollof rice in front of him. Malik shrugged. It was okay. Just okay. She pressed, her eyes searching his face. You used to come home excited about what you learned. Malik hesitated. He didn't want to burden his mother, especially knowing how hard she worked at the university. But as he looked into her concerned eyes, the words spilled out before he could stop them. Mama, my teacher. She doesn't like the way I speak, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She makes fun of my accent in front of the whole class. And the other kids, they laugh at me. Amina's fork froze midair. She set it down carefully, her expression shifting from concern to controlled fury. She what? She asked, her voice calm but laced with steel. She says I don't pronounce things correctly. Malik continued, his eyes welling with tears. I've been trying to sound more like them, but it's hard. It's like my voice isn't mine anymore. Amina reached across the table, taking her son's hand in hers. Malik, she said firmly, there is nothing wrong with your voice. Your accent is a reflection of who you are, and it is beautiful. No one has the right to make you feel small because of it. Her words offered some comfort, but Malik still felt the weight of his experiences pressing down on him. What can we do, Mama? He asked, his voice trembling. Amina's eyes hardened with determination. We're going to fix this, she said. But first, I need to understand exactly what's happening. That night, Amina stayed up late, poring over her notes and researching the school's policies. As a linguistics professor, she had spent years advocating for the importance of linguistic diversity and dismantling the biases surrounding accents. But now, the issue wasn't academic, it was personal. The following morning, armed with research and a fierce determination, Amina scheduled a meeting with the school principal. Malik watched as she prepared her notes, her confidence unshaken. Mama, he said hesitantly, what if they don't listen? They'll listen. Amina replied, her voice steady. Because this isn't just about you, Malik. It's about every child who has been made to feel less than because of their voice, and I won't stop until they understand that. As Malik walked to school that day, a small spark of hope began to take root in his heart. His mother's unwavering support reminded him that he wasn't alone in this fight. Little did he know, her actions would set off a chain reaction that would challenge not only Mrs. Thompson, but the entire school system's approach to diversity and inclusion. The quiet storm brewing in Malik's heart was about to transform into a powerful movement, one that would echo far beyond the walls of his classroom. Voices of the voiceless. Malik trudged into school the next morning, his heart a tumult of emotions. His mother's firm resolve gave him a glimmer of hope, but the thought of another day in Mrs. Thompson's class weighed heavily on him. He kept his head down as he walked through the hallways, avoiding eye contact with his peers. The whispers and snickers had diminished somewhat, but the unease in the air remained palpable. When Malik entered the classroom, Mrs. Thompson barely acknowledged him. She was busy writing on the board, her sharp, precise handwriting filling the space with today's lesson on literary analysis. Malik slipped into his seat and opened his notebook, determined to blend into the background. The tension between Malik and Mrs. Thompson had reached an unspoken but undeniable peak. It was a silent war, with Mrs. Thompson's passive-aggressive comments on his pronunciation clashing against Malik's desperate attempts to stay unnoticed. Every time she corrected him or mimicked his accent, it felt like a fresh wound, a reminder that no matter how much he tried, he would never truly belong in her classroom. Today's lesson started with a discussion on metaphors and similes. Mrs. Thompson, pacing in front of the class, asked for examples. Malik knew the answer immediately, but his hand stayed down. The memory of being mocked still stung. Instead, Clara raised her hand. "The phrase 'timed as a thief' is a metaphor," she said confidently. Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly. "Correct. Very clear and well articulated, Clara. Now, can anyone else provide an example?" A long silence followed. Malik clenched his fists under the desk, his mind racing. He wanted to speak up, to reclaim his voice, but the fear of humiliation was paralyzing. Finally, Mrs. Thompson sighed. "Malik, how about you? You've been awfully quiet. Do you have an example?" The entire class turned to look at him. Malik felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to speak. "The phrase 'life is a journey' is a metaphor," he said softly. Mrs. Thompson frowned slightly. "Good effort, Malik, but it's journée, not journey. Remember, proper pronunciation is key." A few students chuckled, and Malik's face burned with embarrassment. He wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear entirely. But before he could retreat further into himself, Clara spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I understood what Malik said perfectly. Isn't the point of communication to convey meaning, not to sound a certain way?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't respond. Malik turned to look at Clara, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time, someone had stood up for him. During lunch, Clara found Malik sitting in his usual corner. "Hey," she said, setting her tray down across from him. "You okay?" Malik nodded, though his expression betrayed his unease. "Why did you say that in class?" he asked. "Mrs. Thompson might get mad at you." Clara shrugged. "Maybe. But what she's doing isn't right, Malik. And if no one says anything, she's just going to keep doing it." Malik stared at her, a mix of admiration and disbelief in his eyes. He had never met anyone so fearless. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara smiled. "You don't have to thank me, but you should start standing up for yourself too. You have every right to be here, Malik. Don't let her make you feel like you don't." Her words lingered in Malik's mind for the rest of the day. He replayed the moment in class over and over, imagining what it would feel like to confront Mrs. Thompson himself. Could he ever find the courage to do it? Meanwhile, at home, Dr. Amina Okono was preparing for her meeting with the school principal. She had spent the previous evening gathering evidence, compiling studies on the benefits of linguistic diversity, and drafting a detailed account of Malik's experiences. Her goal was not just to advocate for her son, but to challenge the systemic biases that allowed teachers like Mrs. Thompson to go unchecked. The principal, Mr. Stevens, greeted her warmly when she arrived. He was a tall, affable man in his early 50s, with a reputation for being approachable but firm. "Dr. Okono," he said, shaking her hand. "Thank you for coming in. I've heard a lot about Malik. He seems like a bright young man." "Thank you," Amina replied, taking the seat across from him. "But I'm here because he's struggling. Not academically, but emotionally. And I believe the way he's being treated in Mrs. Thompson's class is the reason." Mr. Stevens's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Amina launched into a detailed account of Malik's experiences, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. She described how Mrs. Thompson had repeatedly singled him out, mocked his accent, and made him feel unwelcome. She backed up her claims with research, explaining how such behavior could have long-term effects on a child's self-esteem and academic performance. Mr. Stevens listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as Amina spoke. "This is troubling," he said finally. "I had no idea Mrs. Thompson's behavior was causing this much harm. I'll need to speak with her and investigate further." "I appreciate that," Amina said. "But I'm not just here to address Malik's situation. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to any other student. We need to implement diversity training for teachers, create policies that support linguistic inclusion, and hold educators accountable for their actions." Mr. Stevens nodded slowly. "You're right. This is bigger than just one student or one teacher. I'll bring this up with the school board." Amina left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. She knew change wouldn't come overnight, but she had taken the first step. Now it was up to the school to follow through. The next day, Malik noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. When he walked into Mrs. Thompson's class, she greeted him with a strained but polite smile. The lesson proceeded without any pointed comments or mocking corrections. Malik wasn't sure what had changed, but he sensed that his mother's actions were starting to have an effect. After class, Clara caught up with him in the hallway. "You seemed more confident today," she said. "Maybe," Malik replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think my mom might have had something to do with it." Clara laughed. "Your mom sounds awesome." "She is," Malik said, his voice filled with pride. "She's not afraid of anything." As he walked to his next class, Malik felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that things could get better. And deep down, he realized that he didn't have to face this fight alone. With Clara by his side and his mother leading the charge, Malik began to see a future where his voice, his accent, and his identity would no longer be a source of shame, but a source of strength. Breaking the silence. The morning after her meeting with Mr. Stevens, Dr. Amina Okono sat at her desk, staring at the stack of papers she had prepared for a faculty lecture. Her mind, however, wasn't on linguistic theory or lesson plans. It was on her son. Malik's pain had been etched into her heart, and though her meeting with the principal had been promising, she knew it was only the first step. Changing minds, especially those that had been shaped by years of unconscious bias, required persistence and unwavering courage. In the quiet of her office, Amina made a decision. She would not wait passively for the school administration to act. If the system had allowed Mrs. Thompson to perpetuate her behavior unchecked, then the system itself needed to be confronted. Amina's resolve solidified into a plan. She would speak not only to the school, but also to the community. If the issue was systemic, then the solution required collective action. At Washington Middle School, Malik's day started like any other, though he noticed subtle changes. Mrs. Thompson had begun to tread carefully around him, her tone less sharp and her corrections softer. Still, the classroom dynamics remained tense. His classmates, though no longer openly mocking, continued to treat him like an outsider, their stares and whispers creating an invisible barrier that separated him from them. It wasn't until lunch that the real shift began. Clara sat with Malik as usual, but this time she wasn't alone. A boy with glasses and a mop of curly hair hesitated before joining them. "Hey," the boy said, his voice uncertain. "Can I sit here?" Clara smiled brightly. "Of course, Jacob. This is Malik." "Hi," Malik said, surprised. He wasn't used to classmates willingly engaging with him. "Hi," Jacob replied. He fiddled with his glasses nervously. "I just wanted to say, I thought it was cool how you explained that metaphor in English yesterday. Mrs. Thompson can be tough, but you handled it really well." Malik blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice soft. Jacob nodded and sat down. For the first time since arriving at the school, Malik felt a small crack in the wall of isolation surrounding him. As the three of them talked, Malik began to share stories about his life in Nigeria. Clara and Jacob listened intently, asking questions and laughing at his descriptions of playful arguments with street vendors and the lively chaos of Lagos. By the end of lunch, Malik felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he saw a glimpse of the connections his mother had promised were possible. That evening, Amina took her plan to the next level. She reached out to other parents, starting with Clara's mother. To her relief, Clara's mother was appalled by Malik's experiences and eager to help. "I've heard rumors about Mrs. Thompson for years," Clara's mother admitted during their phone call. "But no one's ever done anything about it. I think people are afraid to rock the boat." "That's exactly the problem," Amina said. "Silence only enables the behavior to continue. But if we stand together, we can push for real change." Over the next few days, Amina and Clara's mother rallied other parents. They organized a meeting at the local community center, inviting parents, students, and educators to share their experiences and discuss ways to address the underlying issues. Word spread quickly, and by the night of the meeting, the center was packed. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation as Amina stepped to the front of the crowd. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the faces before her, some familiar, some strangers. Malik sat in the front row with Clara and Jacob, his eyes wide with admiration for his mother. "Good evening," Amina began, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you all for coming. My name is Dr. Amina Okono, and I'm here as both a linguist and a mother. Tonight, I want to talk about something that has affected not just my son, Malik, but many students in this school and others like it: linguistic discrimination." A murmur rippled through the room. Amina continued, explaining how biases against accents and non-standard English perpetuated inequality and harmed students' confidence and academic performance. She shared studies and personal anecdotes, painting a vivid picture of the long-term consequences of such discrimination. Then she opened the floor. One by one, parents and students came forward to share their stories. A former student of Mrs. Thompson's described how she had been ridiculed for her Puerto Rican accent, which had made her withdraw from class discussions. Another parent recounted their child's struggle to overcome the stigma of speaking with a Southern drawl. Each story added fuel to the fire, solidifying the community's resolve. Finally, Malik stood up. His hands trembled slightly as he faced the room, but his voice was steady. "I used to love speaking in class," he said. "Back home in Nigeria, I was proud of how I spoke. But when I came here, I felt like my voice wasn't good enough. My teacher, she made me feel like I had to change who I was to fit in." His words hung in the air, raw and powerful. Clara reached over and squeezed his hand in support. The meeting ended with a unanimous agreement. The community would demand action from the school board. They drafted a letter outlining their concerns and proposing a series of reforms, including mandatory diversity training for teachers, the creation of a student-led inclusion committee, and regular evaluations of classroom practices to ensure they were equitable and inclusive. When the letter was delivered to the school board the next day, it came with over 100 signatures. As the weeks passed, the movement gained momentum. News of the community's efforts spread, attracting attention from local media. Reporters interviewed Amina, parents, and even students, shining a spotlight on the issue of linguistic discrimination in schools. Malik's story became a rallying cry for others who had experienced similar struggles, sparking conversations not just in Washington Middle School but across the district. For Malik, the transformation was profound. Though Mrs. Thompson remained reserved, she began to make a conscious effort to treat him, and all her students, with greater respect. Malik's classmates, inspired by the community's actions, started to see him in a new light. Slowly but surely, Malik's confidence returned, and with it, his voice. One afternoon, during a classroom discussion, Mrs. Thompson posed a complex question about a poem. Malik's hand shot up. "Yes, Malik," she said, her tone devoid of its usual edge. The poet uses the river as a metaphor for life's journey, Malik said, his voice clear and unashamed. The changing currents represent the challenges we face, and the calm stretches show moments of peace. The room was silent for a moment before Mrs. Thompson nodded. An excellent observation, Malik, she said sincerely. The class erupted into applause, and Malik's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment, but with pride. As he looked around the room, he realized something had shifted, not just for him, but for everyone. The walls that had once divided them were beginning to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of understanding and acceptance. And Malik knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning, the catalyst for change. The months that followed were a whirlwind of transformation for both Malik and the Washington Middle School community. What began as a personal battle for Malik had morphed into a district-wide conversation about inclusion, diversity, and the invisible barriers that hinder students from reaching their full potential. Malik's transformation. For Malik, the classroom that had once felt suffocating began to feel more like home. Though Mrs. Thompson's demeanor toward him remained cautious, she was noticeably more measured in her interactions. The snide comments and corrections stopped, replaced by a neutral professionalism. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Malik, bolstered by his mother's advocacy and the support of his new friends Clara and Jacob, began to regain his confidence. He no longer hesitated to raise his hand in class, and his answers, once delivered in a halting, uncertain tone, were now spoken with clarity and pride. His Nigerian accent, which had been the subject of ridicule, became a source of curiosity and admiration among his classmates. "Say something in Yoruba," a boy named Alex asked one day during lunch. "It sounds so cool." Malik grinned. "O dabo," he said, meaning goodbye. Alex repeated the words clumsily, earning a chorus of laughter from the table, not at Alex, but with him. "That's awesome," Clara said, beaming. "You should teach us more." By the end of the week, Malik had started an informal language club at lunchtime, where he taught his friends simple phrases in Yoruba and shared stories about life in Lagos. The club grew quickly, attracting students curious to learn about other cultures. Malik, once an outsider, had become a bridge builder, creating connections where there had once been divisions. The school's response. While Malik thrived, the larger ripple effects of Amina's advocacy were beginning to take shape. The letter the parents had submitted to the school board sparked intense discussions at every level of administration. Community members attended board meetings in record numbers, demanding not just platitudes but concrete action. Facing mounting pressure, the school board implemented several new policies. These included mandatory cultural competency training. Teachers and staff were required to attend workshops on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the value of linguistic diversity in education. Student inclusion committees. Each school in the district was tasked with forming a committee where students could voice concerns about classroom dynamics and propose solutions. Regular classroom audits. Administrators began conducting surprise visits to classrooms to observe interactions and ensure teachers were adhering to the new policies. Teacher accountability measures. Educators with repeated complaints against them were required to undergo additional training and could face disciplinary action if no improvement was shown. Mrs. Thompson was among the first to attend the cultural competency training. Though she went reluctantly, the experience proved eye-opening. The training sessions included powerful testimonies from students and parents about the damage caused by linguistic discrimination. Hearing these stories forced Mrs. Thompson to confront her own biases and reflect on her role in perpetuating them. One session featured a young man who described how his thick Appalachian accent had made him a target for ridicule throughout his school years. His words resonated deeply with Mrs. Thompson, reminding her of a student she had once taught who had been similarly treated. "I never realized," she admitted quietly during the session. "I thought I was helping them, preparing them for the real world. But now, I see that I was only silencing them." Amina's expanding mission. While the school district worked to implement reforms, Amina's influence grew beyond the local community. Her work as a linguist and her advocacy for Malik had garnered national attention. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and contribute articles to educational journals. One of her most impactful talks took place at a national conference on education equity. Standing before an audience of teachers, administrators, and policymakers, Amina shared Malik's story, weaving it into a broader critique of the systemic biases ingrained in educational institutions. Language, she said, is more than just a tool for communication. It is a reflection of identity, culture, and history. When we dismiss or ridicule someone's way of speaking, we are not correcting them. We are erasing them. And that is a loss not just for the individual, but for all of us. The audience gave her a standing ovation, and several attendees approached her afterward, eager to bring her ideas to their own schools. Amina left the conference with a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a fight for her son's dignity had become a mission to transform education on a larger scale. Malik and Mrs. Thompson, a new understanding. One afternoon, Mrs. Thompson asked Malik to stay after class. He hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but nodded. When the classroom emptied, Mrs. Thompson gestured for Malik to sit. Her usual air of authority was replaced with something softer, almost hesitant. "Malik," she began, folding her hands on her desk, "I want to apologize." Malik blinked, caught off guard. "I've been reflecting a lot these past few months," she continued, "and I realize that I've treated you unfairly. I made assumptions about you because of your accent, and I let those assumptions cloud my judgment. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Malik didn't know what to say. For weeks, he had dreamed of this moment, imagining himself telling Mrs. Thompson exactly how much she had hurt him. But now, faced with her vulnerability, his anger melted into something else. Understanding. "Thank you," he said quietly. It means a lot to hear that." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "You've taught me more than I've taught you, Malik, and I hope you'll continue to speak up, not just here, but wherever life takes you. Your voice is important." Malik left the classroom that day feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The scars of his early experiences wouldn't disappear overnight, but he knew they no longer defined him. A movement takes root. The changes at Washington Middle School became a model for other schools in the district, and eventually, the state. Teachers began incorporating lessons on linguistic diversity into their curriculums, celebrating the many ways people spoke rather than trying to homogenize them. Students who had once felt silenced found new avenues to express themselves, their voices finally heard and valued. For Malik, the journey had been transformative. He had entered Washington Middle School as a nervous boy, unsure of his place in a foreign land. But through his courage, the support of his mother, and the solidarity of newfound friends, he had not only reclaimed his voice, but used it to spark a movement. As he walked home one afternoon, the sun casting long shadows on the sidewalk, Malik thought about how far he had come. His accent, once a source of shame, now felt like a badge of honor, a reminder of where he had been and who he was. And in the depths of his heart, he knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it, one confident step at a time. The seeds of change. The autumn air was crisp as Malik walked to school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the golden hues of the trees reflected his mood. Hopeful, vibrant, alive. The past few months had been transformative, both for him and for Washington Middle School. But Malik knew the work wasn't over. Change, as his mother often said, was not an event, it was a process. A voice for the voiceless. Malik's newfound confidence didn't go unnoticed. In his social studies class, a discussion arose about inclusion and identity. Malik, once silent in group conversations, found himself speaking up with ease. "We all come from different places," he said, addressing his classmates. "But that's what makes this school, and this country, so special. Our differences aren't weaknesses, they're strengths. His words were met with nods of agreement. Clara beamed at him from across the room, and even students who had once mocked him now listened intently. Malik's message wasn't just about his experience. It was about creating a culture where everyone felt they belonged. The teacher, Mr. Reynolds, approached Malik after class. "That was powerful, Malik," he said. "Have you ever thought about joining the student council? We could use someone like you to represent the student body." Malik was taken aback. "Me? I don't know. I've never done anything like that before." "You'd be great," Mr. Reynolds encouraged. "Think about it." The idea stayed with Malik as he walked home that afternoon. The thought of representing his peers, of being a voice for those who felt unheard, filled him with both excitement and fear. But as he passed the community center where his mother had held the first meeting, a memory came back to him, her standing at the podium, speaking with conviction and courage. If she could do it, so could he. Dr. Okono's expanding influence. While Malik considered his next steps, Dr. Amina Okono's work continued to gain traction. Invitations poured in from schools, universities, and organizations eager to hear her insights on linguistic diversity. Amina had become a sought-after advocate, her voice amplifying the stories of students like Malik across the nation. One evening, as she prepared for a virtual panel discussion, Malik joined her in the living room. He watched as she reviewed her notes, her expression focused and determined. "You're amazing, Mama," he said suddenly. Amina looked up, startled. "What makes you say that?" "You're doing so much for me, for other kids," Malik said. "You're making things better." Amina smiled, her eyes softening. "Thank you, my son. But you're the one inspiring me. Your bravery gave me the strength to fight." Malik hesitated, then asked, "Do you think I could do something like that? Help other people?" "Of course," Amina said without hesitation. "Your voice has power, Malik. Use it." Her words stayed with him as he went to bed that night, and by morning he had made his decision. He would run for student council. The campaign. Malik's announcement caused a ripple of surprise among his classmates. For many, he was still the new kid. But for others, he had become a symbol of resilience and leadership. Clara and Jacob immediately offered to help with his campaign. "We'll make posters," Clara said, pulling out a stack of colorful markers. "And we can write a speech for you." Malik shook his head. "I'll write the speech myself. I need it to come from me." Over the next week, Malik worked tirelessly, balancing schoolwork with campaign preparations. His message was simple but powerful: a school where everyone belongs. He spoke about his own journey, his struggles, and the support that had helped him overcome them. When it came time for the candidate speeches, Malik stood before the student body, his palms sweaty but his heart resolute. He glanced at Clara and Jacob, who gave him encouraging nods. Taking a deep breath, Malik began. "When I first came to this school, I felt like I didn't belong. My accent, my background, it all seemed so different from everyone else. But I've learned that being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to celebrate." The room was silent as he continued. "If I'm elected to the student council, I'll work to make sure everyone feels included, no matter where they come from or how they speak. We're stronger together, and I want to help build a school where everyone feels at home." When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Malik's cheeks burned, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from pride. Mrs. Thompson's journey. While Malik's campaign unfolded, Mrs. Thompson was undergoing a transformation of her own. The training sessions she had attended were just the beginning. She began reading books about cultural competence and reflecting on her teaching practices. Slowly, she started to see her students in a new light, not as a monolithic group, but as individuals with unique stories and strengths. One day, she approached Malik after class. "Malik," she said, her tone tentative, "I heard you're running for student council. I just wanted to say, I think you'll be great." Malik blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." She hesitated, then added, "You've taught me a lot this year. I'm proud of you." Her words, though unexpected, filled Malik with a sense of closure. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it was a step toward mutual respect. Election Day. Election Day arrived, and the school buzzed with excitement. Students lined up to cast their votes, discussing the candidates and their platforms. Malik, nervous but hopeful, spent the day with Clara and Jacob, avoiding the voting stations. When the results were announced during the afternoon assembly, Malik held his breath. The principal stepped to the microphone, a sealed envelope in hand. "And the new student council representative is Malik Okono." The gym erupted into cheers as Malik stood, his heart pounding. Clara and Jacob pulled him into a tight hug, their laughter mingling with the applause. As Malik walked to the stage to accept his position, he felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the support of his friends, but for the journey that had brought him here. The road ahead. As the weeks turned into months, Malik embraced his new role with enthusiasm. He worked with the student council to organize cultural appreciation events, create peer support programs, and ensure that every student had a voice. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Teachers praised his leadership, and students who had once ignored him now sought his advice. Malik had not only found his place at Washington Middle School, he had helped create a space where others could find theirs too. At home, Amina watched her son with pride. Malik's journey had been difficult, but it had shaped him into a compassionate and courageous young man. Together, they had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for growth and change. As the first snow of the season fell outside their window, Malik and his mother sat together, reflecting on how far they had come. "This is just the beginning," Amina said, her voice filled with hope. Malik nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I know, and I'm ready." The ripples of impact. Winter descended on Washington Middle School, but within its walls, a sense of warmth and unity began to take root. Malik's election to the student council wasn't just a personal victory. It was a symbol of the change sweeping through the school. Students who had once felt invisible now saw Malik as a beacon of hope, someone who could speak for them and with them. Malik's transformation had inspired not only his peers, but also the adults around him. A new initiative. Malik's first major proposal as a student council representative was ambitious. He wanted to establish an annual event called Cultural Kaleidoscope Day. The idea was to celebrate the diversity within the school by showcasing the languages, traditions, and cuisines of its students. At the first student council meeting of the year, Malik presented his idea. He stood at the head of the table, his palms slightly sweaty but his voice steady. "Our school has students from all over the world," he began, "but a lot of us don't know much about each other's cultures. I think it's time we change that. Cultural Kaleidoscope Day would be a way for everyone to share where they come from and what makes them unique." The council members exchanged glances. Clara, who had joined the council alongside Malik, nodded enthusiastically. "I love it," she said. "It's exactly what we need right now." Jacob, ever the practical one, raised a hand. "How would we organize it?" "We'd need food, decorations, and presentations. It sounds like a lot of work." "It will be," Malik admitted. "But I think it's worth it, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it happen." The council voted unanimously to move forward with the idea, and Malik was tasked with leading the effort. Rallying the school. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Malik and his friends went classroom to classroom, pitching the event to students and teachers. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Students signed up to host booths representing their cultural backgrounds, while teachers volunteered to help with logistics. Malik also reached out to his mother for advice. Amina, thrilled by the idea, offered to connect Malik with local businesses and organizations that could provide resources for the event. "You're doing something incredible, Malik," she said one evening as they worked together on the event plan. "This isn't just about celebrating diversity. It's about building bridges." Malik beamed at her. "I learned from the best. Overcoming challenges. Despite the enthusiasm, organizing Cultural Kaleidoscope Day wasn't without its challenges. Some parents expressed concerns about the event's focus on cultural differences, fearing it might divide rather than unite the students. Malik and the Student Council addressed these concerns head-on, emphasizing that the event was about inclusion and learning, not separation. "We're not highlighting differences to divide us," Malik explained during a PTA meeting. "We're celebrating them because they make us stronger. This event is about finding common ground through understanding." His words resonated, and the PTA ultimately gave their full support. Then there was the issue of funding. While many students offered to bring items from home, there were still costs for decorations, equipment, and other supplies. Malik spearheaded a fundraising campaign, organizing bake sales, car washes, and even a fun run to gather the necessary funds. His relentless determination inspired others, and soon, the school community rallied behind him. The big day. When Cultural Kaleidoscope Day finally arrived, the school was transformed. The hallways were adorned with flags from around the world, and each classroom had been converted into a mini exhibit showcasing a different culture. The air buzzed with excitement as students, teachers, and parents wandered from room to room, sampling foods, watching performances, and learning about traditions. Malik's booth, dedicated to Nigeria, was a highlight. He wore a traditional agbada, a flowing robe, and displayed colorful fabrics, beaded jewelry, and artwork from his homeland. His mother had prepared several Nigerian dishes, including jollof rice and puff puff, which were an instant hit. "Did you make this?" a boy asked, his mouth full of puff puff. "My mom did," Malik replied with a grin. "But I helped." In another room, Clara demonstrated how to fold origami cranes, a nod to her Japanese heritage, while Jacob showcased his grandmother's recipes from Poland. The event was a sensory feast, with music, dance, and laughter filling the school. The highlight of the day was the cultural fashion show in the gymnasium. Students and teachers walked the runway in traditional attire, drawing cheers and applause from the audience. When Malik took the stage in his agbada, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. For a moment, he stood there, basking in the overwhelming support and pride that filled the room. Reflections. As the event wound down, Malik sat with Clara and Jacob in the now empty gym. The three of them were exhausted but elated. "You did it, Malik," Clara said, nudging him playfully. "This was your idea, and it was amazing." "It wasn't just me," Malik replied. "Everyone made it happen." "That's what this is all about." Jacob nodded. "You're right. But you started it. You gave us something to believe in." Malik looked around the gym, his heart swelling with gratitude. He thought about how far he had come, from the nervous boy who had walked into Mrs. Thompson's class on that first day to the leader who had brought the school together. The broader impact. The success of Cultural Kaleidoscope Day didn't just resonate within the school. It attracted attention from the community and local media. A reporter from the town's newspaper interviewed Malik, asking him about his journey and the inspiration behind the event. "I wanted to create something that brought people together," Malik said. "I know what it feels like to be on the outside. I don't want anyone else to feel that way." The article, titled "A New Voice for Unity," became a sensation, and other schools in the district began reaching out for advice on hosting similar events. Malik's work had sparked a movement, one that extended far beyond Washington Middle School, a legacy of leadership. In the weeks following Cultural Kaleidoscope Day, Malik continued to lead initiatives promoting inclusion and equity. He started a mentorship program pairing new students with older peers to help them acclimate to the school, ensuring that no one felt as isolated as he once had. Mrs. Thompson, inspired by the changes she had witnessed, began incorporating lessons on linguistic and cultural diversity into her curriculum. She even invited Malik to speak to her class about his experiences, an opportunity he embraced with both humility and pride. As the school year drew to a close, Malik reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had faced prejudice, doubt, and fear, but he had emerged stronger, not just for himself but for others. His voice, once dismissed, had become a powerful tool for change. And as he stood before the student body during the year-end assembly, delivering a speech about unity and resilience, Malik knew this was only the beginning. His story was still unfolding, and the ripples of his impact would continue to spread. For Malik, the future was bright, and the possibilities were endless. A legacy that endures. The final weeks of the school year were a whirlwind of celebration, reflection, and anticipation. Washington Middle School had transformed in ways no one could have foreseen at the start of the year. The once divided corridors now hummed with an energy of togetherness. Students who had previously been sidelined now found their voices, and teachers had begun incorporating lessons on diversity, empathy, and respect into their classrooms. The Cultural Kaleidoscope Day wasn't just a one-time event. It had ignited a movement. For Malik, the year had been transformative. As the summer approached, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A boy from Lagos, Nigeria, who had arrived in America feeling like an outsider, now stood at the center of a school community that celebrated his leadership and strength. A surprise announcement. On a warm Friday morning, the entire school gathered in the gymnasium for the end-of-year assembly. The principal, Mr. Stevens, stepped up to the podium, his face alight with pride. "Good morning, students, teachers, and parents," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "Today, we're here to celebrate not just the achievements of this year, but also the individuals who have made those achievements possible." As the ceremony continued, Mr. Stevens paused and smiled. "This year, we are introducing a new award, the Unity in Action Award, given to a student who has gone above and beyond to bring our school community together. This award represents resilience, leadership, and the courage to stand up for what is right." Malik sat in the audience, clapping politely, when he heard the words that made his heart stop. This year's recipient is Malik Okono. The gym erupted into applause. Clara and Jacob cheered loudly, and a few students even whistled. Malik sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Then, slowly, he stood, his legs trembling as he made his way to the stage. As he accepted the plaque from Mr. Stevens, Malik's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw his mother in the back of the gym, her face glowing with pride. For a moment, his vision blurred with tears, but he quickly blinked them away. "Would you like to say a few words, Malik?" Mr. Stevens asked, handing him the microphone. Malik hesitated, but then he nodded. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Thank you," he began, his voice clear and steady. "This means so much to me. When I first came to this school, I felt like I didn't belong. I struggled to find my place and my voice. But this year, I learned that belonging doesn't mean changing who you are. It means being accepted for who you are." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I didn't make this happen alone. My friends, my mom, my teachers, they all helped me. And together, we've shown that when we celebrate our differences, we can create something amazing." The applause that followed was deafening, and as Malik returned to his seat, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was more than an award. It was a validation of everything he had worked for. A family celebration. That evening, Amina hosted a small celebration at their home. Clara and Jacob joined them, along with a few other friends Malik had made during the year. The living room was filled with laughter, the aroma of jollof rice and suya wafting through the air. To Malik, Clara said, raising her glass of sparkling cider, "The bravest person I know." To Malik, everyone echoed, clinking their glasses together. Amina watched the scene with a full heart. Her son had not only found his place, but had helped others find theirs too. As the evening wore on, she pulled Malik aside. "I'm so proud of you," she said, hugging him tightly. "You've grown into a leader, Malik, but more than that, you've stayed true to who you are." "Thank you, Mama," Malik said, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done it without you. Amina smiled. This is just the beginning, my son. The world needs more voices like yours. Summer of growth. The summer brought new opportunities for Malik. Through his mother's connections, he was invited to speak at a local conference on youth leadership. Standing in front of an audience of students, parents, and educators, Malik shared his story with eloquence and passion. When I was told my accent made me different, I thought it was something to hide, he said. But I've learned that our differences are what make us powerful. They give us stories to tell and perspectives to share. And when we listen to each other, we all grow. His speech received a standing ovation, and afterward, several students approached him, eager to share their own experiences. Malik listened intently, offering words of encouragement and advice. He realized then that his journey was no longer just his own. It had become a catalyst for others. Mrs. Thompson's transformation. Back at Washington Middle School, Mrs. Thompson continued her own journey of growth. Inspired by Malik's courage and the lessons from her training, she began revamping her teaching methods. She introduced a new unit on global literature, encouraging students to explore stories from cultures around the world. She even invited parents and community members to share their experiences in class, creating a vibrant tapestry of voices. One day, she called Malik's home. When Amina answered, Mrs. Thompson spoke with uncharacteristic humility. "Dr. Okono, I just wanted to thank you," she said. "Your advocacy opened my eyes, and it's made me a better teacher. And Malik, he's extraordinary." Amina smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. It takes courage to change, and I respect you for that." A new school year, a new chapter. When the new school year began, Malik returned to Washington Middle School as a seasoned leader. His role on the student council expanded, and he was asked to mentor incoming students. He took the responsibility seriously, reaching out to those who seemed shy or uncertain, just as Clara and Jacob had done for him. One afternoon, he met a new student named Ahmed, who had recently moved from Syria. Ahmed's English was hesitant, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had faced unimaginable challenges. Malik sat with him at lunch, asking questions about his favorite foods and traditions. By the end of the meal, Ahmed was smiling. "You're not alone," Malik told him. "We've all been there, and you belong here." A legacy that endures. Years later, Malik would look back on his time at Washington Middle School as the foundation of his life's work. He would go on to become an advocate for educational equity, traveling the world to share his message of inclusion and empowerment. But no matter how far he went, he never forgot the lessons he had learned or the people who had supported him. And in the hallways of Washington Middle School, Malik's legacy endured. The Cultural Kaleidoscope Day became an annual tradition, and the mentorship program he started flourished. Students spoke proudly of their identities, knowing they were part of a community that celebrated them. For Malik, it had all started with a single, trembling step into a new classroom. And from that small beginning, he had built something extraordinary, a legacy of courage, compassion, and unity that would inspire generations to come.